Let's hop across the desk to Florence Villeminot, ready to take us through the international front pages, and lots of focus on this situation in Syria, of course, with the Russian airstrikes, government forces staging that offensive to take back Aleppo.
That's right. The UN has warned that up to 300,000 Syrians could be stranded in Aleppo. So these are civilians. And The Guardian reports that up to 1 million Syrians across the country are living in besieged towns. Now, among those besieged towns is the town of Madaya. We've been reporting a lot about Madaya because there was a famine there. Well, you can see here, The Guardian reports that Madaya is facing starvation again because the supplies delivered last month are already running out. Now, The Independent reports that there are fears of starvation in Aleppo as well. And this comes as there are claims that Russian airstrikes killed and wounded children. Now, despite much international outcry, Moscow has denied any wrongdoing.
And yet people are still accusing Moscow of bombing civilian areas and therefore violating international law.
That's right. Human Rights Watch is among those that accuses Russia of indiscriminately bombing civilian targets in Aleppo. You can read more about that in the editorial of The Washington Post, which is very critical of the U.S.'s position in all this. You can see Mr. Obama stands by silent as Russia continues its onslaught in Syria, which, according to The Washington Post, is going to destroy any chance of an acceptable end to the Syrian civil war. It's hard to imagine things getting any worse in Syria, but The Washington Post says things certainly are. We're entering an even darker phase, and it's critical for the U.S. to act now. It needs to bolster rebel forces and create havens for refugees.
Let's turn to the actual refugees themselves. The migrant crisis, as it's being called, dominating much of the European papers, and Le Monde is focusing on the fate of the younger refugees.
That's right. This is really a heartbreaking report in Le Monde today. I definitely recommend reading it. It's talking about the stolen youth of these minors, these refugees that are under 18 years old, Syrians, Afghans, Iranians, Iraqis, fleeing violence and often forced to fend for themselves. And Le Monde reports that these young refugees are actually, unfortunately, often the ideal target for human traffickers and sex traffickers. And according to Le Monde, it has very harsh words for European institutions in general. It's a collective failure of the EU, which, after all, has often put children's rights at the very center, at the very heart of European values. Now, The Independent, the British paper, is outraged by what's happening in the UK. This is a very stunning report you can see here on the front page. Child asylum seekers are deported back to Iraq. Now, this is the Home Office that's admitted that thousands of young people who sought refuge in Britain have actually been deported once they turned 18 years old. And you can see the figures inside the Independent. It's 2,748 people in total. Now, most of them, you can see, have been returned to Afghanistan, but many have also been returned to Iran, Iraq, Libya, Syria. So places which are still dangerous, where they're still facing many threats. And often, The Independent says they no longer have ties in those countries as well.
How terrible. Let's move on to the US politics now. Results are in for the New Hampshire primaries. The big winners, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders.
That's right. Two political outsiders were the big winners. The Daily Beast has a very interesting piece today that says, as surprising as it may be, people who vote for Trump and Sanders actually have a lot in common. They vote for them to feel like winners. These are people who feel abandoned by the political establishment. And so that's why they see Sanders and Trump as kind of a lottery ticket opportunity to beat the system. Now, Sanders' victory in particular has been seen as a very decisive victory, a very big embarrassment for Hillary Clinton. He's turning into a tougher opponent than a lot of people thought he would be. Interesting editorial in the New York Times, though, that says that New Hampshire is really a pressure test for Team Clinton and all the losers in general, because after all, New Hampshire is just a drop in the bucket. And don't forget, it's all about the long run, the essentially waiting until the end of the race.
Goodness, well, it's not a sprint, but a marathon. It's turning into quite the marathon slog. We will, of course, keep following that here on France 24. For now, though, thank you. Florence Villeminot with the International Press Review. And